There were no footsteps when she stepped down from the stagecoach. Only dust, only silence, and the dangling creak of two tiny boots, child-sized, scuffed raw, swaying from her saddle horn like a pair of forgotten ghosts. She didn't speak. Neither did the town. Hawkeye stares from the saloon's wooden balcony. The clink of poker chips froze mid-air. The blacksmith held his hammer aloft as though time itself had gone brittle. No one greeted her. No one moved to help. The driver didn't wait, just flicked the reins and rumbled off in a panic, as if he'd just dropped off trouble stitched into a dress. She wasn't beautiful in the way the West expected. Her hair was dull from wind, her cheek sun-split. One wrist had a scar she didn't bother hiding. And still, something about her made even the sheriff avert his eyes. She stood alone at the edge of town, clutching a letter from a man she'd never met, a widowed rancher who'd written only one line, "Need a woman to raise my sons. I'll pay train fare." He never asked her age. She never gave her name. But she came anyway. Because the boots, those damn boots, deserved a better ending. She reached the edge of the ranch just before sundown. The fence was broken in two places. The pasture smelled of sweat and rust. 3 boys stood near a sagging chicken coop, eyes wide, mouths tight. None of them ran to her. The youngest had a black eye. The oldest held a stick like a weapon, and the middle one just stared at the boots. That's when the wind changed. Sharp, dry, carrying the scent of a place that hadn't been cleaned in months. Then came the rancher. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, face carved by years of too much grief and not enough sleep. His shirt was torn at the collar. His wedding ring still clung to his finger, worn to a thin groove. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just watched her like she might break if he blinked. She thought he might tell her to leave. Instead, he turned and walked inside. The screen door didn't slam. He left it open just a crack. That was the only invitation she got. So she stepped forward, boots crunching softly, dust curling around her hem like fingers from the grave. Each step was a decision. Behind her, the stagecoach was gone. Ahead of her, 3 boys she didn't know. To her left, the porch. To her right, nothing. She took the saddlebag, the letter, and the boots. Those damn boots. She hadn't let go of them in 3 years. Not when she crossed Kansas. Not when she slept in haylofts or bartered bread with her wedding ring. Not even when she thought about jumping into the river that night in Amarillo. They belonged to a little girl who once whispered, "Mama, make me wings." She tied them to the saddle as a promise: you'll never be forgotten. You'll never be nothing. You'll never just disappear. Now they bounced softly as she walked, not like footstep, more like memories, faint, hollow, unfinished. The boys didn't follow her inside. They just watched like cattle, unsure whether she was a person or a storm. Inside, the house was a shrine to pain. Dirty dishes, rotting wood, dried blood on a curtain, a cradle in the corner, overturned and empty. The rancher didn't say anything, just poured a tin cup of water, set it on the table, and walked out the back without looking at her. She drank it, not because she was thirsty, but because it was something. And sometimes in the West, something was the closest thing to salvation. That night, she slept on the floor. She didn't unpack. She didn't undress. She just lay next to the saddle with the boots between her and the dark. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled long and low, like a mother calling to a child who'd never answer again. In that moment, something twisted in her chest. Not grief, not quite. Something colder. Something that hummed like a lullaby cut short. She closed her eyes and whispered back. Not words, just sound. Something between a prayer and a curse. The boots stayed tied to the saddle all night, casting tiny shadows on the wall as the firelight flickered. Like feet still dancing in a world too cruel to hold them. By morning, the boots had dust on them again. She wiped them clean without thinking, her fingers tracing the cracked leather like they were skin. The saddle still leaned against the door, untouched. She hadn't unpacked. She wasn't sure she was meant to. The house hadn't changed overnight. It still smelled like rust and bitter coffee. She stood up slow, her spine aching from the floor, and stepped outside. 3 boys were in the same spot, same postures, same silence. One of them was hammering a crooked nail into a post, missing half the time. The youngest was dragging a dead crow with a string. The middle boy just watched her again, unblinking. The rancher was at the far end of the fence, repairing a section with methodical rhythm lift. Hammer, pause. A limp in his left leg made every movement look like it cost him something. She didn't wave. He didn't look up. She walked to the horse. Its reins were still twisted. Its water bucket was empty. She filled it. Slowly. Let the horse drink. Then reached to untangle the reins until a shadow moved beside her. He was there. The rancher didn't say a word. He just knelt down, ran a hand across the worn leather, and began untying it himself, silent, precise, like he was undoing something sacred. When their fingers brushed, her breath caught. His didn't. Then, without meeting her eyes, he stood, led the horse to a shaded post, tied it with a double loop, and walked away. She watched him cross the yard, favoring his limp. At the porch, he paused just for a second, then opened the door, left it open again. The same way he had the night before. That was his way of speaking, she realized. Not with words, with doors left open and with animals watered. With silence that wasn't cruel, just old. She stepped inside. The boys had followed this time. Not all the way, just close enough to see what she'd do next. There was no bed made for her. No corner cleared. She moved to the kitchen, began sweeping with her hands, then with a cracked broom, then scrubbing the sink, then soaking the cloths in rainwater. The youngest crept forward first, still dragging the crow. She said nothing, just motioned gently. He handed it over, its feathers slick with dew. Not blood. She buried it with a spoon behind the house. Didn't say a prayer. Didn't expect one. The rancher came in later that afternoon with a bleeding hand and a fistful of nails. He walked straight past her and set them on the counter. She wordlessly reached for a rag. He didn't protest. She cleaned the wound like she'd done it before. Because she had. But not for him. He flinched slightly, but not from pain. From memory, maybe. When she wrapped his palm, he stared at her hands. Not her face, not her dress, just her hands, as if trying to understand who had taught her how to care like that. Fence post cracked, he murmured. His voice was gravel and smoke. Storm last week. She nodded. Looks like it hit you too. He almost smiled. Almost? Then he went back outside, and the door creaked half-closed behind him. That night, she sat by the hearth, not because it was warm, but because it was central. Everything in the house breathed around that fire, half-lit pictures on the wall, the hollow of a cradle, the shadows under the stairs. She didn't eat much. The food was hard and flavorless, but she didn't complain. The boys eventually came in, sat on the floor. Not near her, but not far. One of them dropped a spoon. She picked it up, didn't say a word. The fire popped loud once, like a shot. The youngest flinched. The middle one whispered something in the older boy's ear. The boots were still on the saddle, just outside the door. Every gust of wind made them knock gently against the leather like someone tapping to be let in. She rose slowly, went to the porch, and moved them an inch to the left, closer to shelter. Not inside. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Neither was the house. The moon rose silver and sharp that night. It lit the dry fields, the broken fence, the barn with its slanted roof. She sat on the porch until her legs numbed. The rancher stepped out once. He didn't speak. He didn't sit, but he stood just long enough for their silences to touch. And when he walked back in, he left the door open again, just wide enough for a shadow to pass through. That was all the welcome she'd get. It was enough. In the days that followed, she spoke very little, and yet her hands spoke for her. They scrubbed iron pots with salt, lifted the youngest boy into a chair with quiet grace, folded the same shirt 3 times until the crease was just right. There was a gentleness in the way she moved, but also a discipline like her motions had been trained through necessity, not affection. A woman who had survived more than she was willing to name. No one told her what to do. But the work seemed to find her. The windows that hadn't been touched in years now let in light. The cradle was turned upright not for a baby but to hold firewood. The barn doors creaked a little less when she tightened their hinges. One morning, the middle boy brought her a hammer with a splintered handle. She didn't ask why. She just took it, sanded it smooth, and handed it back. That was how trust began. Not with words but with wood rubbed bare. By the 3rd day, she started singing. Not full songs, just pieces, hums. Notes that seemed to rise only when she forgot anyone was listening. One of the boys leaned closer when she did. She noticed but didn't stop. That evening, after dinner, the youngest tracked mud through the kitchen. Instead of scolding, she carried him outside, barefoot, into the trough where she splashed his feet with a tin cup. The water was cold. He gasped. She smiled just barely and wiped his legs with her apron. Then, to everyone's surprise, she knelt in front of the other 2. She didn't ask, just poured more water. The middle boy hesitated, looking at his father. The rancher gave no sign, no nod, no shake of the head. The boy sat down. She cupped his ankle like it might shatter, wiped away the day's dust with a cloth that had once been part of a curtain. Then the eldest sat down beside them, wordless. And for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something almost like peace. The rancher watched from the porch. He didn't say thank you, but his boots didn't move. He stood there until long after the boys were clean and the stars began to appear, one by one, like old memories returning without permission. Later that night, when the boys were asleep, she took a chair outside and placed it beside the saddle. The boots were still there, unmoved, dusty. She stared at them for a long time. Her fingers itched to take them in, wipe them down, place them somewhere proper. But she didn't. Not yet. They weren't ready. She wasn't ready. Instead, she sat beside them like one would beside a grave. And in that silence, she remembered water. Not the kind in the trough, but a river, a place where everything ended. It had been raining that day. Hard, and the river rose faster than her screams could carry. She had jumped in too late, or maybe not at all. She couldn't remember. What she remembered was the boots, floating downstream, one after the other. When she pulled them from the bank hours later, they were soaked, lifeless, still tied together by a lace that hadn't come undone. She'd carried them ever since. Now, they hung by her door, not as a warning, not as guilt, but as a question that had never been answered. She reached toward them, paused, then pulled her hand back. Not tonight. Inside, the rancher stirred. He walked to the window, saw her there, and said nothing. But he lit the oil lamp by the door, left it burning, and on another kind of open door, on another kind of welcome, and somewhere deep in her chest, something exhaled, not forgiveness and not yet, but something close. She watched the stars that night until the cold curled under her dress and into her bones. Then she stood, walked to the door, paused. She turned to the boots one last time. Tomorrow, she whispered. Not a promise, not a lie, just hope. She stepped inside and left the door open behind her. The clouds came in heavy that evening, low, slow, and bruised purple. A wind rose from the east, the kind that shook the window panes before a real storm arrived. Thunder stayed just out of reach, grumbling like an old man refusing to wake. Inside the house, something else was brewing. Not rain, not wind. Memory. The middle boy had refused supper. She found him by the hearth, staring into coals that hadn't yet burned down. His fingers were tight around a slingshot, his jaw locked. She crouched beside him, not too close. You know, she said, voice soft. There's a town back east where girls don't run. He looked at her, blinked, but said nothing. Not because they're brave, she continued, because they're never taught how. He turned his head slightly. The slingshot trembled. She kept going. In that town, girls grow up quiet, like doors left half open. They learn to keep secrets in their shoe. Some of them don't even know how to shout. Outside, lightning forked across the dark. The boots rattled softly against the saddle. I was one of them, she whispered. The boy stared now, eyes wide, still mute. Once, there was a girl who wanted wings, told her mama, "I don't want to walk, I want to fly." So the mama bought her boots, just a little big, so she could grow into them. Her voice cracked on grow, not loud, not dramatic, just enough. The boy's gaze drifted toward the door, toward the port, toward the boots. Someone took her, she said. No thunder this time, just silence. Deep, awful silence that pressed against the walls like floodwater. She was wearing them, she whispered. When they took her, the slingshot slipped from his grip, hit the floor with a soft thud. She didn't look at him then. Couldn't. She stared into the fire and let it flick shadows on her face. I waited by the river for hours. She continued, waited so long the sky turned gray. Thought maybe she'd float back. The wind pushed hard against the door. Neither of them moved. She never did. But the boots did. One. Then the other. She drew in a slow breath, like someone trying not to drown. They were all I got back. Then a creak on the stairs. The rancher. She didn't turn to look, but she knew it was him. She felt him watching from the shadows just above the second step. The boy looked up, met his father's gaze, but neither man nor child spoke. Sometimes, she said softly, I think if I hang on to him long enough, maybe the river will give her back. The boy stood, walked to the door, opened it, let the wind howl in. She followed slowly and watched him as he stepped onto the porch. He didn't touch the boot, didn't speak, just stood there with his hair whipping in the stormlight, staring out at the fields. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he didn't look afraid of her. She stepped beside him. The boots danced in the wind, swinging gently from their saddle string. She was 5. She murmured. Her name was... She stopped. The boy waited. She didn't finish. Some names aren't meant to be said under thunder. Behind them, the rancher had come to the doorway, one arm braced against the frame, his face unreadable. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort. But when she walked back inside, his eyes followed her like she was something wholly fragile and half-broken, but still standing. That night, the wind blew hard enough to rattle the windows. The boots tapped and tapped and tapped, but she didn't move them. Not yet. The boys slept. She sat by the fire. The rancher passed by once with an empty glass, paused, looked at her. Thank you, he said. It was the first full sentence he'd spoken since she arrived. She didn't answer, just nodded once, slowly. Outside, the boots swayed, and in their rhythm, a lullaby, not one she'd sung before, but one she might sing again. The night was dry again. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush that felt thicker than any noise. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. She sat alone on the porch, knees drawn up, a needle threading through the sleeve of a boy's torn shirt. Every stitch was deliberate, small, measured. The boots no longer hung from the saddle. They rested at her feet now, upright, cleaned, polished, as if waiting for someone they no longer fit. Inside, the boys slept, their breathing gentle, overlapping. Like waves against wood was the house's only rhythm. She folded the shirt and rose. Her legs were stiff from sitting too long, but she moved quietly, as if the silence itself might bruise. Through the window, she saw him, the rancher, asleep in the chair, firelight flickering on the lines of his face. He looked older when resting, not from age but from carrying too much for too long. She stepped inside without sound. The room was warm, but the night had cooled his skin. His hand twitched in sleep, perhaps from pain or dream. She took the blanket from the back of the couch and moved gently, pulled it up to his chest, paused. That's when his hand touched her wrist, not a grip, not a plea, just touch. His eyes opened. Slowly, steady. They didn't speak. The fire cracked once sharp. She didn't flinch. He looked at her like a man who'd been walking across a desert and suddenly realized he'd stumbled into water. And then he leaned forward. Not fast, not bold, just forward. Their foreheads touched. And she closed her eyes. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't hungry or wild. It was the kind of kiss you give to someone who survived the same avalanche. Their lips met in silence. No fireworks. No swelling music. Just breath shared between two people who hadn't touched kindness in years. When it ended, neither of them stepped back right away. She rested her head lightly against his, and he let her. The blanket slid slightly down his chest. She pulled it up again, then turned, quietly, and walked to the hearth. Sat down beside the boots, laid her hand across them like a parent checking a child's fever. He watched her from the chair. Watched her until his eyes closed again, not from exhaustion, but from peace. The first real sleep he'd had in months. She stayed by the fire all night. Not because she feared waking him, but because something inside her was changing shape. Something that had lived coiled and afraid. By morning, the sun lit the floorboards gold. The boots were no longer near the door. They were beside the hearth now, gently tucked beneath the bench where the boys kept their books and firewood, as if they belonged in the house at last. The middle boy saw them first. One, he didn't say a word, but his fingers reached out to touch the toe of one. She watched from the kitchen, watched as he looked up at her. Uncertain, she nodded once. He didn't ask whose they were. He just placed them side by side neatly, precisely, and walked away. That day, the rancher didn't limp as much. He came in from the fields with dust on his sleeves and placed a new jar of preserves on the table. "Trade from town," he muttered. She wiped the lid, set it on the shelf. That night, they ate together without speaking. But the silence was full, and the house no longer felt like a room made of ghosts. It felt like breath, like warm bread, like something building, something good. Later, as she walked to her room, he brushed past her in the hallway. They didn't touch, but they didn't have to. He paused as she passed, whispered, almost under his breath, "I don't want you to go." She didn't answer, didn't need to. Some things are said with footsteps, others with the way a person chooses to stay. The first sign was the stillness, not quiet stillness, like the world had tucked in its breath, waiting for something to break. She felt it while collecting eggs, her basket half full. The sun not yet over the ridge. The chickens didn't cluck. Even the wind seemed to crouch. Then came the boot print, near the well. Deep, wrong, too wide for the rancher, too fresh for a stranger just passing through. She felt her throat tighten like a rope drawn quick. She walked faster, then ran. The middle boy met her halfway to the house. "Smoke!" he gasped. She turned. Black plumes clawed upward from the barn. The fire moved fast, too fast, like it knew its target, like it had been waiting. She dropped the basket, eggs shattering like bones. The youngest boy was still inside. So was the eldest. She screamed. Not words, just sound. The rancher was already running, shirt half-buttoned, eyes wide with fear that stripped him of age and injury. She grabbed a soaked burlap sack and followed. Inside, the flames danced like demons. Heat curled the air, turning every breath into a prayer. The rancher burst through the smoke, cradling the eldest. The boy coughed, limp but alive. "The little one," he started, but she was already gone. She found the youngest crouched behind a feed barrel, face streaked with soot, crying without sound. She pulled him close, wrapped the sack around them both, and crawled. Wood cracked above her. Beams sagged. Her dress caught fire. She slapped it out with trembling hands, dragging the boy inch by inch toward light. A beam collapsed behind her with a scream of timber. The path out was gone. And then through the smoke, a shadow. The rancher, he'd come back. Of course he had. Together, They braced under a beam, shoulders pressed, breath ragged. He shouted something she couldn't hear. She saw only his eyes, fearless, pleading. She shoved the boy forward into his arms. The beam groaned louder. The rancher pulled the boy free, then turned. She followed. The world exploded. A side wall collapsed just as they cleared the door. Flames reached after them like jealous hands. They hit the dirt hard, coughed, cried, alive. The barn crackled behind them, a funeral pyre for everything that had once been broken, except them. They were whole until she saw the boots. One was lying in the mud, near the trough. The other gone, swallowed. She crawled toward it, hand outstretched, fingers digging through ash and gravel and old blood. But there was nothing. Gone, like the girl who once wore them. The rancher came to her slowly, a blanket over his shoulders. The youngest boy safe in his arms. He knelt beside her, looked at the one remaining boot. "I saw him," he said. Her breath caught, near the well. Watching, she didn't have to ask who. Some ghosts wear flesh. Some men haunt their own bones. Her past had found her, and tried to silence her the way men always do, through fire and fear. She clenched the boot. Her nails dug into the leather. The rancher placed his hand over hers. "You're not running anymore," he said. It wasn't a question. That night, she stood barefoot in the dark, ash on her hem, the boys asleep, the fire still smoldering in the fields. She held the single boot against her chest. It was lighter than she remembered, or maybe she was stronger. She walked to the porch, set it down, not on the saddle, on the railing, where it could be seen, where it could stay. The rancher came out quietly. He didn't speak, just stood beside her. And after a moment, he reached for her hand. No pressure, just presence. They stood like that until the sky bled orange and the smoke drifted into memory. Two people, one boot, no more running. The wind returned in spring, but it no longer howled. It whispered, carrying the smell of damp soil, wood smoke, and something sweeter, wildflowers blooming where ash once clung to the roots of the earth. She had planted them without ceremony, just a handful of scattered seeds, pressed into the fire-blackened ground outside the barn. Now, purple and gold blossoms stretched tall beneath the sun, as if the soil had decided it was done grieving. The single child's boot remained on the porch, sun-faded and peaceful. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost, just of what had survived. She never searched for the second. Some things are meant to remain in flame. Instead, she taught the boys to plant onions. The youngest didn't like dirt under his nails, so she showed him how to use gloves. The middle one asked why onions and not corn. "Because onions make you cry," she said with a smile. "But they feed you better." She read to them in the evening, sometimes from books she found in town, sometimes from memory. One night, the eldest asked where she had learned to read. She paused. "In a place I won't return to." That was enough. They stopped asking. The rancher fixed the barn with his own hands, refusing the sheriff's offer to help. "It was my fire to clean," he told him, and the sheriff, knowing better, let it be. One afternoon, after a long day fencing the east pasture, the rancher came in with a box. He didn't say where it came from, just handed it to her. Inside were 4 pairs of boots, 3 small, one her size, all new, stiff, unworn, unclaimed. She touched the leather with quiet reverence. "What are they for?" the middle boy asked. She looked at him. "To walk forward," she said. That night, she placed them in a row by the door, not beneath the saddle, not hidden, beside the hearth, beside the old one. 3 new, 1 old, 1 missing, and that was enough. When the middle boy had a nightmare, she was the one who came. When the eldest bloodied his knuckles, it was her voice that soothed. And when the youngest asked if she would stay forever, she didn't answer. She just stayed. The rancher grew quieter, not with distance, but with trust. He would touch her shoulder when passing, brush his hand against hers when they sat, Not possession, not demand, just proof that love could be soft, even when it came from calloused palms. One morning, she found a letter on the porch. No return name, just a smudged seal. She read it once, then threw it into the fire. She didn't speak of it, and he didn't ask. Some stories are finished by silence. Later that week, she took the boys into the hills and taught them how to follow the wind without getting lost. Walk with your eyes, not just your feet, she said. The youngest nodded. The middle asked if he could bring the slingshot. The eldest already understood. As they walked, she reached for a wildflower and tucked it behind her ear. The rancher saw it later and smiled for the first time in weeks. Not a grin, just enough. In the quiet of the evening after supper, he stepped behind her as she washed dishes, pressed his forehead lightly to the back of her neck. No words. She closed her eyes. She had stopped expecting joy a long time ago, but here it was, quiet, rough-edged, and real. By midsummer, the flowers had overtaken the place where the barn had burned. One boy said it looked like heaven. She didn't argue. The old boots stayed near the hearth, the leather softening in the heat. Sometimes, the youngest would trace it with his finger. Sometimes she would too. Not with sorrow, but with memory. Not a wound, a scar. The rancher never asked her for more. He knew some people bring pieces of fire with them, and all you can do is love them gently until they stop burning. That fall, when the first frost came, she stood on the porch in her new boots. They weren't broken in yet. Still stiff, but she walked. And the boys followed, and the rancher, quiet as ever, walked behind them, hands in his coat, watching the wind weave through her hair like it belonged there. She bent down once, gathered a handful of soil, and let it fall between her fingers. I used to think I was running from shadows, she whispered. Now she was planting them. Sometimes, we carry pieces of the past like broken glass, careful not to bleed, but never quite able to let go. We live half-present, haunted by what didn't survive, but healing is rarely loud. It doesn't come in thunder or applause. It comes in stillness, in choosing to stay, in folding a child's shirt 3 times just right, in kissing someone without expectation. This story reminds us not all wounds need to be erased. Some just need room to breathe. Some need boots left by the hearth, not as trophies of pain, but as symbols of endurance. We don't heal by forgetting the river. We heal by planting flowers near its edge. To anyone who has survived fire and come out carrying ash, know this. Your softness is not weakness. Your silence is not emptiness. Love will come not to erase what was lost, but to walk with it. Even one boot can mark a trail forward. And if you're reading this and carrying something too heavy, set it down. Let the ground take it. Then step into your life again. Even if the boots are new and stiff, it's okay to begin again. Even now. Especially now.